Good morning and welcome to another in our virtual Sunday School class series. I want to begin by expressing my thanks to Jimmy Whitehead for all that he's done in making this possible. If we had one of those screens where we gave credits, Jimmy would be the videographer, the sound producer, the director. So Jimmy, thank you for your loyalty. And I want to thank John and Rhonda for making up our Sunday School class in person for the last number of weeks. Today, we are actually going to finish up the series that we've been doing on the last words that Jesus spoke from the cross. Originally, I'd kind of planned on filling maybe one of the previous lessons again, but now it appears that since the church is not going to be back open, Sunday school classes for at least a few more weeks. We'll be starting a new series next week, so I hope those of you that are watching will be tuned so that you get the benefit of the opening in that series. Today, we are going to be looking at some words from Luke that Jesus spoke from the cross, from the 23rd chapter of Luke. And I read these words, verses 32 and then also 39 through 43. Two others also, who were criminals, were led away to be put to death with him. One of the criminals who hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you the Messiah? If so, save yourself and us." But the other criminal rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said to Jesus, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." Now, I find this conversation between these three people hanging on these crosses to be really compelling. Indeed, for me, the more I study this, the more this second criminal becomes one of the most compelling persons in the Bible. Now, my inspiration for this particular lesson came from a sermon that Dave taught, now several months ago. And he read these verses that I read to you earlier. And even though I'd heard them multiple times before, they really spoke to me when Dave was reading them. And I, for the first time, tried to imagine what it would really be like to be present and have three people hanging in agony and pain on a cross, and then these exchanges taking place. And so I invite you, as we go through the lesson this morning, to try to get a picture in your mind of what it must have been like to have actually been there and heard these words spoken. Now, one of the resource books that I've been using, Adam Hamilton, in his book, Final Words from the Cross. I told you last week that one of the things Adam Hamilton does is he takes different characters who were actually present at the crucifixion, and then, using a little bit of information we have from the Bible, but a lot of his imagination, he creates a story about what this person may have seen, what they may have heard, and what they were thinking. And I think it's a useful exercise because Adam Hamilton doesn't make any pretense to say all of this is biblical, but it makes a point, and he does have as a basis for it the information that's in the Bible. And I say all of that to say this. For this particular conversation that took place between the three hanging from the cross, Adam Hamilton takes the second criminal and tries to bring him to life for us. And he says, maybe this second criminal got started in his life of crime at an early age. At age 15, he participated in an armed robbery, had already been doing things that were wrong. And then by the time he reached age 20, he had actually murdered another person. He was, by all accounts, a helpless cause. And in Adam Hamilton's fictional account of this second criminal, he imagines that second criminal might have had friends that actually had heard Jesus speak. And he had heard that Jesus actually befriended people that were of unsavory character, sinners such as the tax collectors, prostitutes, and outright criminals. And according to Adam Hamilton, he says, I thought to myself, I don't believe in a Messiah, but if I did, that's the kind of person that I would like to have as my religious leader, somebody that really understood and felt sorry for and identified with those people that weren't, quote, good people. The second criminal was not at all surprised that he was being executed. He always kind of assumed that that's the way his life would end. But he found it somewhat ironic that at his march to his death, which he felt was justified, that one of the people that was walking up that hill with a cross with him had done little more than try to make other people happy, give comfort to their lives, some gentle person. And again, in Hamilton's account, he quotes the criminal as saying, I will tell you that for some strange reason, I couldn't take my eyes off of this man. I was fascinated by him. And then as they trudged up the hill and they saw this large group of people, the soldiers, the religious leaders, ordinary people, most of them were shouting insults at Jesus. And then according to Hamilton's account, the second criminal was thinking, I want to join those people that are insulting Jesus. But he says, I didn't have the heart in it. And then to continue with that account, he says, after he thought that, he looked at Jesus and he said, all of a sudden, it looked like he was looking right through me. He looked at me with such compassion that even in my pain, I felt myself drawn to him. For it was the only time in my life that I felt like somebody really looked at me and really cared for me. And when I heard my partner in crime, the other criminal, shout out and say something sarcastic to Jesus, I just replied back to it, stop it. You and I are getting what we deserve, but he's done nothing wrong. Then the second criminal thought for just a minute and he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Adam Hamilton closes his account of this by saying, and the second criminal said, when he heard these words, the greatest thing that ever happened to me in my life happened, because he replied, truly, I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise. Now, understand that Adam Hamilton was taking this person, giving a little bit of what we knew that he said, and throwing in some facts that may or may not have occurred. But it's clear that that second criminal did see something in Jesus. He did have some regrets about what was taking place. The first criminal quickly joined the crowd. Those people that were up on the hill, the soldiers, the authorities that were taunting Jesus, the first criminal quickly joined in on that. And I was reminded as I prepared this lesson, Linda and I were watching just a few nights before I'd prepared the lesson, one of those TV shows of Ted Bundy, the serial killer. And after going through all that Ted Bundy did, they have a scene that takes place at Rayford when Ted Bundy is actually being executed. And the scene outside that was shown on television were all of the people there that were rightly incensed at the terrible things that he had done. And you could hear them shouting out all of these vile words at Ted Bundy. And that's probably what that crowd was doing there. And that first criminal was joining in on that, because those remarks were directed to Jesus. And he was glad they weren't directed at him. So he gladly joined in. So can't you just imagine the sarcasm that first criminal, when he looked at Jesus and said, and I paraphrase, if you're so great and powerful, why don't you save yourself and save us? Now, it's awful easy to be really, really critical as we look at it in retrospect, and you have a criminal saying that to Jesus sarcastically, if you're so powerful, why don't you save yourself and us? And yet, it may well be that we are closer to that way of thinking than we are to the thinking of either of the other two that were hanging from the cross. Because sometimes when things get really tough for us, when we're faced with a desperate situation and we don't get the answer we want, or we don't get it in the time we want, there's a big temptation to say, Jesus, if you're up there, why aren't you helping take care of this problem? And some people get disillusioned with the whole concept of Christianity, because what they had hoped would come to save them at that last moment or lift them from that disillusionment didn't happen. And so sometimes even good Christians get disillusioned and turn away from the church. And so we have to be real careful, because we may be more like that first criminal than we like to imagine. Do we really know what we would say if we were moments away from death? If we were fixing to be executed and we had somebody next to us that we thought could save us? Would we really be in a prayerful, forgiving mood? Or would we just sarcastically say out to him, why don't you save us? Adam Hamilton, and for those watching, will have the benefit of seeing this on the screen. John and Rhonda, you'll have to just imagine this. But Adam Hamilton gives this quote: I am increasingly less convinced that the first criminal words in any way resembled the mockery of the soldiers and shameless bystanders. No, I believe that the first criminal was honestly trying to pray in the face of this most horrific experience. But the only way he knew how to pray was in the form of a challenge, a demand. It's the prayer of those who think that a saving miracle is the only thing that will help us know Jesus. And when you have that kind of prayer and it goes unanswered, then, as I say, far too often, stray from Christianity. We blame the things that aren't going right in our lives on God. Now, what I'd like to do very quickly is let's just take a deeper dive into the psyche of this second criminal, because under the greatest stress anyone can imagine, I suggest to you far greater than the problems we're experiencing even within the last several months, because he was moments away from his death. He had lived a lifetime of crime. Undoubtedly, he had all of these guilt feelings in him. And still, he had the strength as a criminal, as a career criminal, to turn to his partner in crime, the other criminal, and say, we have been condemned justly. He has done nothing wrong. I suggest to you that's great insight. The candor that the second criminal with which he spoke. He didn't try to make any excuses for his life. He didn't blame his parents. He didn't blame the legal system. He accepted the fact we are getting what we deserve. And I got to tell you, I find that an admirable quality. He could not have been more clear. We were justly condemned. And the second thing that just jumped out at me about this second criminal was that, notwithstanding the pain and suffering that he was suffering, because he was suffering just like Jesus was hanging from the cross, he was able to genuinely think about someone else. How unlikely that would be for most of us if we're there undergoing that kind of pain. We're feeling sorry for ourselves, and yet he could dispassionately look at Jesus and say, but he did nothing wrong. I was reminded again, I happened to watch the other night for the first time in 40 years, Gone with the Wind. And I was really struck by all of the heavy thinking that went on in that movie. I'd forgotten why it was considered one of the great movies of all time, but there's some pretty deep theological, psychological information that goes forth. Those of you that may have seen the movie may remember. Rhett and Scarlett just go through a series of several years of just back and forth where each is hurting the other, and you wonder if this love is going to find itself. And then there comes a point where Scarlett just does something that's just the last straw. And Rhett, that's it for him. And you're hoping, because it's a movie that you want to feel good about, that is there, as Rhett's walking out of the mansion, and Scarlett's over there apologizing and crying and realizing that the love of her life is fixing to walk out the door, and she says, "Forgive me. I know I was the one that was wrong last time. I'm sorry." And then it was that classic scene where Rhett turns around and looks at her and says, "Frankly, Scarlett, I don't give a damn." Just the opposite of the approach that we see from Jesus on this cross. But there's a third thing about this second criminal that I find particularly admirable. He totally embraced the majesty and authority of Jesus. For him, at that point, there was no longer any doubt about who Jesus was and about the concept of a life hereafter. He wasn't sitting there worrying about what's this going to be, who is this person, what power does he have, what's going to happen to me after I die. Jesus had long taught that if you knock, you shall enter. You will be forgiven. The second criminal knocked. And all he asked for, as humbly as he could, was that you remember me when you come into your kingdom. He didn't say, "Forgive me for everything I've done, let me go free, take care of me, take me off of this cross." He just said, "All I ask is, would you remember me when you come into your kingdom?" Adam Hamilton, in his book, to illustrate this point, tells of a country doctor who went out to visit a patient who was dying. And the doctor knew when he went there that this was going to be the case. And as he went inside he took his old dog with him, and the dog's out on the porch. The physician's in there talking with this dying patient. And the patient looked up at him and he said, "Doctor, would you tell me, what is it really going to be like in this next life?" And the doctor looked at him and he said, all of a sudden he heard his dog scratching on the door trying to get in. And he said, "No, I can't describe it for you, but I will tell you this. My dog's out there. He doesn't know what's inside this house. But the reason he's scratching that door is he knows his master's inside." And he said, "That's the hope that I give to you." We are going to, as we continue to look at those verses, remember that these verses present a parable about our Christian journey. One criminal chose to join the doubters, those that were skeptical, those that cried out, those that did not understand. The other criminal humbly, just simply said, "Will you remember me when you're in paradise?" The one gave us a parable about how to die, the other just the opposite. So in closing this lesson, I want to turn to the third person who was being executed that day. We had these two extremes in the form of the two criminals. We turn to the third person, Jesus, who was being executed. And it's ironic, and perhaps not ironic, that at his death, Jesus was hanging between two criminals. Because in death, as in life, he associated with sinners. And this troubled the religious leaders. This was a part of what they simply didn't understand. In Luke 15th chapter, 12th verse, we hear the Pharisees and the scribes grumbling. "This person welcomes sinners and eats with them." Jesus allowed the prostitute to wash his feet. He had dinner with a tax collector. He touched lepers. He met with unclean people. When Jesus was around people of that ilk, they didn't feel small or ignored or feel like they were being judged, because they understood what Jesus told us in Luke 19th chapter, 10th verse, these words: "The Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost." And Jesus was carrying out that mission even at the time of the cross. In describing the criminals, the two criminals, Luke uses the word keragakos, which literally means those who do evil works. He leaves no doubt these two men were criminals. Matthew and Mark used the word lestai, L-E-S-T-A-I, a term that was used for armed robbers, bad people. But even with his last words, Jesus was reaching out to these two sinners, a murderer, saying, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." I want to close this lesson with a story of a man who was named Ron, who was an Afro-American prison guard. When he retired, he became active in his church, and he was looking for some form of ministry. And he agreed to join the ministry of volunteers who met and prayed with prisoners at the Leavenworth Penitentiary, which was in the same town he was in, the church that he was in. And as a part of that ministry, that volunteer ministry, he met with one of the prisoners who was a convict by the name of Mike. Mike had had a troubled home. At age 14, he stole his first car. When he was 16, he had already been guilty of robbery. And then he was sentenced to 20 years at Leavenworth. I suggest to you a career much like one of these criminals, or both of these criminals that were hanging in the cross. And while he was in prison, Mike became a member of the Aryan Brotherhood, white supremacist group. And this was the man that Ron was called to work with. Here you have an Afro-American prison guard and a white supremacist member of the Aryan Brotherhood who had grown up in a life of crime. And Ron's first reaction was, "That's not what I signed up for. I'm just not comfortable. I can't bridge that gap." But he decided to give it a try. And so he just started meeting with Mike and at least just offered him some compassion and love. And over a period of time, Mike's hatred of blacks began to diminish. And he reached the point where he not only didn't hate, but he, just because he had been face to face with Ron, because he had seen the face of Christ as he looked at Ron, he began to appreciate him, began to like him. And over time, Mike became a new creature in Christ. He became a new man, a Christian. And it raises the question as we go back and look at this scene of three men hanging on the cross. What would happen if every one of us went through that difficult process that Ron went through with Mike, that Jesus went through with those criminals, people who are lost, who don't have a great deal of hope, and if we tried to simply show them love and compassion, even if we could not fully articulate all that Christianity has to offer, if we could at least show them love and compassion, if we did that, is it possible that we could change the face of one person, maybe a neighborhood, maybe a community? And in closing, I just suggest to you, if we are going to try to do that, there is no better starting point than to remember those words Jesus spoke. "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise," because that is the great hope that we have to offer for those who need that kind of love and compassion. And if we could close with prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, as we search for ways in which we can be your witness, as we turn and look toward those people that are not followers, people who have faults and flaws, and as we try to determine our role in your kingdom, give us the heart to be able to say to them, we understand, we care. And in doing so, help us show your face in a world that truly needs to see your face. These things we ask in your name and for your sake. Amen.